Afternoon. I'm Joseph Gildenhorn, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Center and to the 2006 Jan Ratsiu Democracy Lecture. I would like to welcome the members of the Diplomatic Corps, and in particular, the representatives of the Romanian Embassy, and it's also good to see so many friends of the Center here today. Tonight's lecture is a very special event for the Center. It is the first of a series of annual lectures by renowned or emerging democracy activists who are thoughtful practitioners and engaged thinkers. Bringing together scholars and policymakers is in fact central to the mission of the Wilson Center. Since it was established in 1968 as the nation's living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the Center has been a forum for advanced, serious, and open dialogue on questions of policy relevant to the nation and the world community. As both a distinguished scholar, the only American president with a PhD, and a national and international leader, Woodrow Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. Here at the Center, we commemorate the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson by providing a link between the world of ideas and the world of policy. The Jan Ratsiu Democracy Lecture honors the deep commitment to democracy of the late Jan Ratsiu and recognizes his contributions as a distinguished Romanian leader and a political thinker. We are honored to have with us tonight members of Jan Ratsiu's family, his wife Elizabeth, who's here today, and his two sons, Indre and Nikolai. We very much appreciate the cooperation and support of the Ratsiu Family Foundation over the past few months. It's a privilege to have with us tonight Dr. Saad Ibrahim, the recipient of the 2006 Jan Ratsiu Award. Professor Ibrahim is one of the most prominent Arab sociologists and one of Egypt's leading democracy activists. And I'm very pleased to say that he's one of ours. He was a public policy scholar about a year or so ago. So welcome, Doctor. His keynote speech tonight is entitled, "Are There Democracy Lessons Arabs Can Learn from Eastern Europe?" Dr. Ibrahim, I thank you for making a long trip from Cairo, and it's a long trip, I can tell you. And we're delighted to welcome you and Barbara back to the Wilson Center. We also have the privilege of being joined by one of the world's leading authorities on contemporary Islam to introduce our keynote speaker. Ambassador Akbar Ahmed is the Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at American University in Washington, and he is a former High Commissioner of Pakistan to Great Britain. And several of his numerous books, films, and documentaries have won major awards. We greatly appreciate his willingness to join us this evening. Let me just say a few words of thanks to those who have worked so hard to make this evening possible. First of all, I want to commend Dr. Christian Osterman for his leadership of the Center's History and Public Policy Program, which has organized this event. And I also want to thank Mircea Munteanu, I got it, on Christian's staff. Mircea was born in Romania, and it's been very helpful to have one of our own Romanians on hand as we develop our cooperation with the Ratsiu Foundation. I'd also like to thank Hala Esfandiari, the director of our center's Middle East program, which is co-sponsoring this event. And let me also recognize the important support of individuals from outside the center, Professor Elliot Sorrell of George Washington University and Mrs. Gilliam Quinby of the Friends of the Ratsiu Family Foundation. Let me also add that the Ratsiu Democracy Lecture is being organized in cooperation with Georgetown University, where Professor Steve Heidemann in particular has been a valued partner. Thank you again for coming this afternoon, and now I'll call on Nikolai Ratsiu, President of the Foundation, for his remarks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. Thank you very much, Ambassador Gildenhorn, for your introduction, and a large thank you, obviously, to the Woodrow Wilson Center for having us here and being ready to cooperate with our vision at the Foundation. Thank you very much to the Ambassador. Also, I'd like to thank quickly the director of the Wilson Center, Christian Osterman, projects director Mircea Munteanu, and not to forget our senior advisor Elliot Sorel. Without these people, we wouldn't be here today, and the lecture would not be taking place. Also, I'd like to also thank Gillian Quimby for who is the director of the Friends of the Ratziu Democracy Lecture, and thank you to the audience for being for being here with us. You probably will ask yourselves what to us one of the connections was between the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Ratziu family, and indeed Washington. Interestingly, one of our ancestors from the 19th century, Dr. Jon Ratziu, was positively put in prison for his stand for the recognition of the rights of the Romanian people. He didn't see the day come when the Romanian people gained their rights within Romania in Transylvania, but his wife and daughter did. Of course, Wilson was his principles that enabled the establishment of independent nations after the after the First World War. Why Washington? And that is because in the 1980s, Jon Ratziu came here, and he came to Washington to seek support for his lobby in the West to make the rest of the world understand just what an appalling regime there was in existence in Romania. And it was in Washington and not in other European cities around the world. It was in Washington where he obtained support. And he was unusual as an Eastern European campaigner at that time. He was inspired by the help that he got in Washington, the support he got in Washington, and that inspiration led him to found an organization called the World Union of Free Romanians, which by 1990 had established 26 branches around the world. One of the things that all Romanians, if those who know Romanians will tell you, that it's very difficult to get 3 Romanians together in a room and get one opinion. You'll probably still get 6. So to do this in the outside world was an achievement. He then, in the name of the World Union of Free Romanians, he then went back to fight the election in 1990. One of the things that kept him going, I think, as an inspiration to all those who fight for freedom and democracy in their own countries. He used to say that if the people in Romania, this was in the 70s and 80s, if the people in Romania can understand and know that there is somebody out there in the West still fighting for their rights and to re-establish freedom and democracy in that country, that little glimmer of hope, that little candle in the West will brighten their darkness. And if he could achieve that, then he would be fulfilling his promise to help his own people. It's the Ratziu Foundation want to recognize people, and this is the purpose of this lecture, people who in other parts of the world fulfill that same function, that same that are prepared to fight for to stand up and be counted, to see freedom and democracy prevail in their own countries. And that is why we're here today, and that is why we've asked Professor Saad Ibrahim to come, and that is why we have awarded him with the Jon Ratziu Lecture Award. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Hades Vandiari. I run the Middle East program at the center. I suppose I was asked to moderate this meeting because our 2 speakers are from the region. It really is a special privilege to moderate a discussion with two such distinguished scholars who project a totally different image of Islam. I think I would leave it at that because you know what I mean. I would like to introduce Ambassador Akbar Ahmed, who is then going to introduce Saad Ibrahim. Ambassador Ahmed is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at the American University in Washington, D.C., and is among the handful of the world's leading authorities on contemporary Islam. He's the former High Commissioner of Pakistan to Great Britain, as Ambassador Gildenhorn mentioned, and he has advised Prince Charles and met with President George W. Bush on Islam. His numerous books and films and documentaries have won many awards, and his books have been translated into many languages, including Chinese and Indonesian. And I'm not going to read you the list of his books because otherwise I'll be speaking for a good half hour. Dr. Ahmed has presented and narrated The Glories of Islamic Art, the three-part television series for Channel 5 in the UK, which was broadcast, I think, last week, and we were talking during the reception, and it has had fantastic reviews, and we are looking forward to seeing it here, I think, in the fall. He's also a senior fellow at the Case Foundation in Washington, D.C., and gave the inaugural lectures for the first chair in Jewish-Muslim studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and he was the first Muslim to lecture at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ahmed is the principal investigator for Islam in the Age of Globalization, a project supported by the Brookings Institution and the American University and the Pew Research Center. And he's a visiting fellow at Brookings in addition to his appointment at American University. He's now working on the Book of the Travels and television series. We are delighted to have him with us, and welcome to the Wilson Center, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you so much, Hale, for that very warm introduction. We want to very firmly keep the focus on the great man on my left. So, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, introducing Saad Ibrahim can be an easy task or a complicated one. Having been asked to do so this evening, I can simply say that a legendary scholar like Saad Ibrahim is too well known to really need an introduction. I could add some vague pleasantries and voice empty cliches. But I will try to do the impossible, which is to make sense of the life of a Muslim scholar in the 21st century at the intersection of so many global developments. I will do so as objectively as I can, acutely aware that Professor Ibrahim's life and predicament as a commentator of his own society reflect those of all of us involved in writing and thinking about Muslim society. I will approach my introduction on three levels: a brief biography, an introduction of Professor Ibrahim's scholarship, and finally, the impact of that scholarship on the world. I would also like to compliment the Woodrow Wilson Center for hosting the Yon Ratsu Democracy Lecture and everyone concerned for selecting Professor Ibrahim to deliver it. His life and message reflect the purposes of Ratsio's own vision. It is a great paradox, characteristic, and a hopeful feature of our time that the ideas about democracy and human rights of a man from East Europe are echoed by a scholar in the Arab world who is introduced by someone from South Asia at an event in Washington, D.C., and to such an distinguished audience, an event which has gathered such a distinguished audience. And I know many of you have come from outside Washington, D.C. I know my friends, Dr. Hedri is flown in from Kansas, and my sister here, Simi Hassan, is flown in from Colorado, especially for this occasion. Such, indeed, is the miracle of the age of globalization and the power of ideas. Tonight, Mrs. Razio, I know that the spirit of your husband will be pleased. You will rest in peace tonight. I first met Professor Ibrahim at Princeton a quarter of a century ago. About 2 decades ago, when my book, Discovering Islam, was printed, Professor Ibrahim reviewed it and introduced it with characteristic generosity to Arab readers in the Middle East. So we go back several decades. Born in 1938 in Mansoura in Egypt, Professor Ibrahim is the author of many books on the Arab world and the recipient of many awards. Many of these awards come from the Arab world. He has written over 100 articles in Arabic and English periodicals and appears frequently in the national and international media. He is currently the head of the Ibn Khaldun Center in Cairo and a professor of sociology at the American University in Cairo. He has been an advisor to the Egyptian government and is a frequent and popular visitor on campuses throughout the world. Not only did he advise President Saad, but was frequently advising President Mubarak when he was vice president. Mubarak's wife Susan was Ibrahim's student and did her MA with him. He said that he was, quote, flattered that Mubarak and his wife would ask him for advice. The relationship continued after Mubarak became president, when he took over from Sadat. Ibrahim felt that Mubarak had successfully stabilized Egypt after that traumatic assassination. But when he was challenged by the Islamic militants, Mubarak was alarmed. Once again, he turned to Professor Ibrahim. Professor Ibrahim was given a television chat show specifically aimed for young people. For 5 years, the program called the Enlightened Program was broadcast. Ibrahim helped Mubarak in his first 2 presidential terms. But it was in his 3rd campaign that Ibrahim began to feel that the president was not living up to his promises of change. And Ibrahim now became critical. When Mubarak continued to ignore Ibrahim's recommendations, Ibrahim felt that he was not serious about change. When Ibrahim suggested that the Muslim Brotherhood should be taken seriously and its members inducted into government ministries, Mubarak was offended. That was the turning point, according to Ibrahim himself. His own research, his academic research, had led him to some interesting conclusions in the late 1990s. Ibrahim had been arguing for the need to talk to those who claim to speak for Islam, a very solid and sensible suggestion. And I hope those in Washington who have anything to do with power are listening. He had alerted the authorities to probably what they knew in private, but were not prepared to concede in public. Without incorporating the pain and the anguish of ordinary people, they would have little alternative but to seek more militant expressions. This was a trend throughout the Muslim world. Professor Ibrahim was also pointing out that the United States policy in the Middle East was failing because it could neither predict nor account for change. He himself did not see his role as a provocateur. He said, I quote him, "What I do is to raise issues that nobody else would raise, not to be provocative, but to be a conscience for my society, for my country, for my time." But bureaucracies being bureaucracies, some senior members of the government saw this as political criticism, and in a blatantly knee-jerk reaction arrested, tried and condemned Ibrahim to 7 years hard labor for the charge of defaming the government. For safe measure, they also throw in charges of corruption and moral turpitude. If it is any consolation to Professor Ibrahim, these charges are standard fare for anyone perceived as a threat in most parts of the Muslim world. I'm afraid the men of power do not have much imagination when it comes to feeling vulnerable from scholars like Ibrahim. Indeed, your friend Professor Lawrence Rosen of Princeton University and myself wrote an article in the Chronicle for Higher Education when we heard about Professor Ibrahim's arrest, making this very point. As someone who conceived and completed major films and projects on Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, who for me embodied democracy, women's rights, minority rights, and respect for the law, I am familiar with the jealousy of individuals and the smear campaign. I know how lonely the struggle can be and how surreal the talk of democracy and rights. One day I was praised to the skies, and the next slandered and defamed. I was never sure who was saying what and why, and I knew exactly how my friend was feeling. When Ibrahim was arrested, the fear and uncertainty of his position was overtaken by his fascination as a sociologist with his environment. He's in jail. He's got these prisoners. And here's what he says. It was a field day for me as a sociologist. So he makes us envious. We all want to go to jail. I began to feel bad. I wasn't arrested. If there's any consolation to being prisoner, it is having this human laboratory. You see a part of the Egyptian body politic that you can't see outside. This was true. In terms of authentic anthropological insights, Ibrahim's vantage point was unmatched. Conditions in jail were not only appalling, but the very notion of justice had been reduced to a farce. People had been imprisoned for years on the most flimsy of charges. With little hope of justice, individuals and society were driven to desperate acts. It was precisely this very argument that Ibrahim was warning against in his work. In one sense, he had become a victim of the veracity of his own work. The leaders of Egypt were happy to shoot the messenger and ignore the message. Ibrahim was not alone in being arrested. 27 of his colleagues at the Ibn Khaldun Center were also jailed. Ibrahim was personally mortified. I feel very responsible. And if there's anything that saddens me about the ordeal that I went through, it was what happened to my family and young colleagues. I regretted that the government made others pay who were completely innocent, who had nothing to do except being my aide, being my associate. If we were in a respectful, law-abiding society, then none of this would have ever happened. Once in jail, Ibrahim quickly discovered who his true friends are. This is an interesting comment Ibrahim makes about Egyptian intellectuals. And I found this as much a sociological comment as a Shakespearean one. Now here I'm quoting him again. I also learned how easily Egyptian intellectuals could be cowed and intimidated. Few were prepared to risk the wrath of the government. Some probably took delight in my predicament, but it was quite revealing to me. Most of his colleagues and supporters ignored his plight, and it was only very slowly that the trickle of support began for him in the country. That support was stimulated by the sense of outrage which began to develop abroad. Ibrahim was rapidly adopted as a major civil rights figure by the international world, and pressure was put on the government to release him. In 2003, after 14 months in prison, Egypt's highest criminal court acquitted Ibrahim of all charges. Once he came out, international institutions and the media feted him. There was talk of his running for the presidency of Egypt. If he did run and succeed, then perhaps the lessons he learnt as a prisoner, I am sure, would be most useful in implementing jail reforms. When I met him in Egypt and Cairo last December, I was delighted to see that Ibrahim's spirit had not been broken by his ordeal. He had the same twinkle in his eye and the sharp sociological insights to offer that I knew of old. I felt strangely proud and reassured as a person desperately promoting a discussion of scholarship and democracy in Muslim society. Considering the shabby treatment of Professor Ibrahim, it would be tempting to dismiss the status of scholars and knowledge in Islam. That would be a mistake. Islam places the highest emphasis on knowledge. The Prophet of Islam had said, "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." Many Muslims may not know this saying, and most people in the West are unaware of it. But this saying alone has enormous implications for how Muslims contemplate our world. The Prophet had also urged Muslims to go as far as China to acquire knowledge. It is well to recall that China for the Muslims in the 7th century would be like visiting an entirely different world. The word knowledge or ilm is used more often in the Quran than any other word except the word for God. This is in the ideal, and Muslims are aware that the reality of their present societies is far from the ideal. Muslim scholarship is unsatisfactory when compared to other regions in the world, according to all the statistics available to us. Take the yardstick of the Nobel Prize itself. The Muslim world population, which is about 1.4 billion people, has only produced a few Nobel Prize winners. Paradoxically, the winners have not been well received in their own societies. Indeed, some have been the victims of vicious physical and verbal attacks. There are almost 60 states which have a Muslim majority population, and most of their leaders are dictators, whether in uniform or out of them. Dictators, unfortunately, do not promote open scholarship. Their egos and their systems are built on the false vision of courtiers who seek little more than self-promotion. One of the first victims of these tyrants is the scholar. That is why the plight of the scholar is one of the most neglected and important areas of studies in the Muslim world. By marginalizing, persecuting, and sometimes murdering scholars, society is depleted of perhaps its most valuable asset. Little wonder that scholars find refuge abroad, and usually in Western societies, and very often end up at the Woodrow Wilson Center like Hale sitting here with us on the panel. Unfortunately, the depletion of scholarship means that Muslim societies have a long way to go before they can begin the process of internal healing and then of identifying the correct course of direction for the future. It is well to reflect that if this could happen to Ibrahim, who is both an American citizen and married to an American, then what is the fate of an ordinary Muslim who may not have the privilege of either American citizenship or an American wife? We need to create a world in which Muslim scholars are not an endangered species. Professor Ibrahim can take consolation in what he has become, a metaphor for Muslim scholarship today. As head of the Ibn Khaldun Center, he is aware of the life of that scholar. Ibn Khaldun, one of the great heroes and founding fathers of sociology, was himself a metaphor for his society in the 14th century. Ibn Khaldun lived in a time of turmoil and change. He too suffered the vagaries of fortune. In my book, Discovering Islam, I concluded my discussion of Ibn Khaldun thus. Ibn Khaldun's life also teaches us many things, confirming them for us in our own period. The uncertainty of politics, the fickleness of rulers, the abrupt changes of fortune, in jail one day, honored the next, and finally, the supremacy of the ideal in the constant, unceasing search for ilm or knowledge, and therefore the ultimate triumph of the human will and intellect against all odds. Thank you, Saad Ibrahim, for providing us, through your life, an example of the ultimate triumph of the human will and intellect against all odds. I give you Professor Saad Ibrahim. Thank you.
Good evening. I could have listened to you but all night. I hope you have your remarks in writing so my wife can take them with her. I'm glad she's here tonight. She heard firsthand. Coming to the Wilson Center is a homecoming for me. I spent some time here 2 years ago, and I hold this place with a lot of affection in my heart. Along with Columbia, NYU, the Wilson Center received me immediately after I got out of prison, gave me all the moral support I needed, gave me also opportunity to reflect and to write. And I cannot begin thank so many. So I will just group the family in order to get to the task at hand. And thank you all at the Wilson Center. And then my next, of course, set of thanks is to the family that is responsible for bringing me here on this occasion, the Ratio family, which I had the pleasure of meeting them last night, having dinner with them last night. Remarkable family. I only regret that I did not have the privilege of knowing the pater familias, the head of the family. On his name, I am being honored tonight. But I came as close as possible to sitting next to Elizabeth, his wife. She gave me a glimpse of what her husband was like. When I was notified of this award, I began to do research. I have heard of Jan Ratio and did not really know much, just very scant awareness that he was a freedom fighter in Romania. However, as Eastern Europe changed at the end of the 80s, throughout the 90s, I took greater interest in reading and studying and analyzing the experience of Eastern Europe. And in that respect, I became aware that here is a set of very rich and diversified experiences that we must learn from, must utilize as Arab democrats struggling in one of the most authoritarian regions of the world today. And then, upon preparing the lecture here, I started reading more about Jan Ratio himself, and I discovered in the process several parallels, which convinced me again that fighters for freedom do have a lot in common. In this particular case, I found that he and I spent a great deal of our life away from our countries, in exile, fighting our battles from foreign lands. He and I were seduced by women in these foreign lands, he by Elizabeth, me by Barbara. So despite our fierce fighting for freedom, we yielded to this seduction. And probably one of the greatest achievements of Jan and myself is having met these two women and having given in to them. The third important thing that I found is that we had a lot of disappointments in our lives. And one of these disappointments was regarding the presidency. Both of us made a bid to the presidency of the respective countries, and both of us were betrayed and ultimately did not make it. We failed. But nevertheless, we are here in the name of this great man. His country has been liberated. My country is yet to be liberated from dictatorship. And hence, I would like to draw some lessons from Romania and also, in that context, from the rest of Eastern Europe. Let me start by a heading that I had in my notes about the third democratic wave, which political scientists and social scientists have written about it in the last 20 years. That wave, third wave of democracy, started in Portugal in 1974. After nearly 30 years, even more than 30 years, of dictatorship, Salazar regime, finally that regime came to an end and democracy struck in Portugal. 1974, the Portuguese probably did not realize that what they did, what happened in their country, was the beginning of a great transformation worldwide. Usually people in the midst of a great transformation do not realize what their individual acts, what their collective will can produce. But that's exactly what happened in Portugal 74. A year later, Spain, Franco, another dictator who had ruled Spain for over 30 years also, disappeared, passed away, and the Spaniards, seeing next door neighbor, smaller, and to the Spaniards probably less developed, took their clue from the Portuguese and started a democracy of their own. Very quickly, a year later, another country in southern Europe called Greece, which was the birthplace of democracy, also took note of these other two southern European countries and brought down a military dictatorship that has been ruling Greece for several years. That was the beginning of that third wave, as Professor Huntington calls it, as many political scientists call it, the third wave of democracy. Began in southern Europe, then it will swing to Latin America. Score of countries in Latin America will also throw off military dictatorship, fascist regime, and install democracy. And then that wave will cross all the way to the Pacific, from the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, where East Asia, several East Asian countries joined that wave, including Korea, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, Bangladesh, and several others in South Asia. And then the wave, the democratic wave, will swing back to Europe, this time to Central and Eastern Europe. And that is where Romania and much of my remarks will center in the remainder of this talk. Beginning, as you all know, with Poland, 1980, late 1979-80, a trade union, shipyard builders, will split off from the general union of Poland, which was communist-controlled, of course, and will establish one of their own, which they called Solidarity. And that will trigger a series of small events in Poland, nothing big, but it broke some of the taboos in totalitarian countries. For a small union in a small country to split off and to establish its own and to demand reform was something novel in Eastern Europe. Of course, with that solidarity, several things did help. One of them was the fact that there was a Polish Pope in the Vatican, and he was very much sympathetic, and he put the Catholic Church in Poland under the disposal of this union and of other reformer at the time. It helped also that 5 years earlier, the Eastern Bloc, having run into all kinds of economic troubles, because of the arms race, because of the mismanagement of their economy, because of public sector inefficiency, were in dire need for Western help, for food, for trade, for technology. So they swallowed their pride and began to approach the West for help. And the West obliged and said, yes, sure, they can offer, they can use help, but for a small price, and that is to expand the public space in the respective countries of Eastern Europe. Public space, a new terminology for the communists that they could not quite grapple with. And when it was explained, human rights, civil liberties, freedom of movement, some freedom of expression, in return for food, for technology, for favorable trade terms, in the typical communist mentality, what they were asking for were hardware things, goods, concrete goods, very material concrete goods. What the West was asking in return was very fuzzy: human rights, public space, civil society, freedom of movement. Sure. So the communist regimes, led by the Soviet Union at the time, agreed to these terms for the concrete hardware goods. Little did they know when they signed that they were really signing their undoing, because in few years the effects of the Helsinki, that package was done in Helsinki and was known 1975 Helsinki Accord. That Helsinki Accord was really the beginning of the end of the authoritarian, totalitarian communist regimes. They did not know it at the time. Nobody knew it at the time. But it seemed to have produced the desired effect. And we don't even know whether the Western negotiators who made that accord or who drafted the accord had any idea that it will produce these results so big and so soon. But it did. It did. And the beginning, as I said, was in Poland. It took about 10 years. 10 years for that process of undoing communism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism in Poland to finally bring down the communist regime. Well, that was Poland, and that was the beginning. One of the great lessons that we will learn as Arab Democrats is that everybody began to follow the demonstration effect of Poland on the rest of Eastern Europe. All predicted that change will come, except in one country, Romania. Romania was believed to be an exception. So Czechoslovakia had already witnessed uprising against the Soviets before. So did Hungary. But Romania never did. Didn't have any history or any collective memory of defying communist rules or defying authoritarianism. And it was in the total control of both a communist party and a brutal ruler, dictator by the name of Ceausescu. And he was nicknamed as a combination of Stalin and a sultan. So in the literature, you encounter the description of Ceausescu as Stalinistic regime or as a sultanic regime. The word sultan is reference to the ruler in Oriental countries associated with what Marx and other social scientists call Oriental despotism, a ruler who has total control over everything. Well, Ceausescu had both, had a communist party and therefore he was a totalitarian ruler on one hand, and very brutal and dogmatic at that, and hence he deserved to be Stalin-like, or to be labeled as the Stalin, the last Stalin of Eastern Europe. But he also had this extravagance and arbitrary sultanic oriental tendency in his style of governance. Well, anyhow, Romania was therefore thought to be an exception. And we began to hear about, in those years, about Romanian exceptionalism. Yes, it could happen anywhere, but not Romania. And even the Romanians seem to have believed that they are incapable of emulating other Eastern European countries, like next door countries like Hungary, like in Czechoslovakia, like in East Germany, like in even Bulgaria. These countries seem to have been different, even to Romanians. And as we heard from Nikolai, when even three Romanians could not get together or anything, this was also part of the self-image of the Romanians about their ability to organize and to march and to mobilize. However, events in Romania will prove that there is no exception, really. It's just the right moment, waiting for the right moment. So many forces under the surface could be working to produce certain results, unintended, unnoted, but they were at work, and they were. In the Czech uprising, which took place exactly 1 week after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we had Poland first, and then the fall of Berlin Wall, and then the Czech uprising against communism. In that uprising, interestingly enough, there was a big poster hanging from a high building in central Prague with the following phrases on it. Poland took 10 years. Hungary, which had already its own uprising, took 10 months. Let us see if we can do it in 10 days. That was a challenge in Czechoslovakia. And they did, actually. They did. In 10 days. Or to be exact, 12 days. It took 12 days. From the first demonstration to the fall of the Communist Party, it took 12 days. Close enough to 10 days. Now the Romanians and their exceptionalism may have as well, if they had anticipated, but nobody had thought of Romania at that time, they could have said, it took Poland 10 years, it took Hungary 10 months, it took Czechoslovakia 10 days. Let us see if we can do it in 10 hours. And that's exactly what it did. And this is remarkable, unbelievable. Even the Romanians themselves did not believe what they did. Ceausescu was so sure of himself and of his party and of his secret police called Securitat that he took a trip, despite all the turmoils around him in Central and Eastern Europe. He took a trip, very relaxed trip, very long trip to Iran. Just upon coming home, he began to find a little bit of unrest. So again, he ordered his followers to come out in the streets and to show the world that he is really in control. And it was that demonstration, again unanticipated, that will turn against them. Unanticipated. It was a surprise. calling on the army, to come to help the secret police, to help the police to put it down, the army was reluctant to do so. And the army was reluctant because in Czechoslovakia, the same thing had happened. When the Communist Party tried to call on the army, Minister of Defense, to come to their help, to the help of the police and the secret police, the Minister of Defense in Czechoslovakia said no, he will not let the army fight the Czech people. Well, obviously, the same thing happened in Romania, and that was the end. And you all know the story that Ceausescu, with his family and few of his closest aides, escaped, but they were chased until they were arrested and then very brutally killed or murdered or executed. This is, again, so much for Romanian exceptionalism. Now we know there's no country that is immune to change, and especially is immune to democracy or to freedom. This is a global hunger, starvation for freedom everywhere. How it expresses itself, when does it succeed? Yes, it will differ from one country to another, from one region to another. But if we learn anything from the Romanian experience, it is never to give up, never to lose hope, and to be patient until the moment comes. And that moment is ultimately welcome. Social scientists talk about the neighborhood, regional neighborhood. And obviously the regional neighborhood was ripe and was helpful. Countries around Romania had already gone through that. And never underestimate what we call demonstration effect. Demonstration effect, because in the time or in the age of instant communication, of electronic media, people do turn on television, radio, they listen, they hear, they compare. And that's basically what happened. And therefore, it didn't really have to take 10 years in Romania, or even 10 months, as happened in Hungary, or 10 weeks, as happened in Czechoslovakia, or 10 days, as happened in Czechoslovakia, but quickly. With the demonstration effect, you don't have to go through the same thing. You don't rediscover the wheel. And what the Polish solidarity did was to learn, and to go through trial and error. And by the time they really completed their transition or their transformation to democracy, they have accumulated many lessons that the rest of Eastern Europeans did not have to go to rediscover everything from the beginning. Let me just quickly, because I am more interested in having a dialogue and questions after my talk. In one of the very important turns in Eastern Europe was a role played by religion. And this is, again, remarkable, because having lived under communism, these countries, and under Marxism, religion was written off as passé, an institution that was condemned to fade away. And of course, you know the famous phrase by Marx, I don't have to repeat that, about religion as an opium that from which it's an addiction that people have to recover, and they thought that communism will help people recover from that. Well, surprisingly, despite all of this prediction about the role of religion, it didn't materialize the way Marxists or even modernization theorists sometimes predict about the declining role of religion or the death of God, so to speak. Well, it did not. That did not happen. And in many places, as I already alluded to, in Poland, for example, the Catholic Church played a very important role. Now, where does this take us? It takes us that instead of making all of the sweeping comments about religion, Professor Ahmed did talk about Islam and the role of Islam. And the Arab Democrats, Muslim Democrats, have to come to grips on where religion will fit into the fight for liberty and for democracy. We have examples that Islamists and Muslim activists could in fact be enlisted as democratic activists as well. Not in all cases, not in all countries, but there are enough examples of Muslims and Muslim activists turning to democracy as a preferred way of governance. There we have enough evidence of that. We have Turkey, we have Morocco, we have Indonesia, we have Malaysia, we have Bangladesh. In all of these countries, Islamic parties or parties with an Islamic agenda or an Islamic reference point did come to the battle for democracy and did participate in ridding their respective countries from dictators, from authoritarian regimes. And in many of these, they respected the rules of the game. And here I just want to take a minute or two to dispel some of the, again, the notions like Arab exceptionalism, Islamic exceptionalism, that somehow the wave of democracy breaks on the shores of the Arab world or the Muslim world. Well, that's empirically is not true. You look empirically closely, you see the following. You see that out of the 1.4 billion Muslims who are living in the world today, 2/3 of them, and I repeat, 2/3 of the Muslims in today's world are living under democratically elected governments. Democratically elected governments. Now, these democracies are emerging democracies. They are not as established as the American democracies. They are not Westminster democracies, but they are democracies nevertheless, in the sense that people have a chance to choose. People have a chance to say yes and to say no, to debate, to learn the art of democratic governance. We have that. We hope to have more of that. Even in countries like Egypt, my country like Palestine, where Hamas won an election, we believe, as a democratic advocate, I believe that in due time, some of these Islamists could not only be recruited in the ranks of Democrats, but could also be a great asset to democracy in the future. And here is the argument I will make. Sometimes democracy, like modernity, is criticized as being a Western import and therefore doesn't have proper cultural legitimacy. I argue that with the Islamists embracing democracy, they will give it the kind of cultural legitimacy that will make it part of the way of life in these societies. They could, in due time, Islamists emerge, evolve to be like what we have in the West, like Christian Democrats. And that is a challenge that many of us as democracy advocates are taking on. And this is a challenge that I hope you and the Ratio Foundation, and I will speak about that in a minute, will help us do. Because the examples and the experiences of Eastern Europe have taught me that, yes, there is demonstration effect among Eastern Europeans themselves. But interestingly enough, even though Eastern Europe is a very close region to the Arab world, yet many Arabs did not look to Eastern Europe as an example for very interesting reasons. During the honeymoon between Arab dictators and the Soviet Union, say between 1955 and 1975 or 80, Arab countries learned that Eastern Europe brings to them the following. Arms, they buy arms from Eastern Europe. Regimes, authoritarian regimes, send their secret police to get trained in Eastern Europe. So Eastern Europe became a code name for a world that sends arms, trains secret police, train them in spying and in torture. And therefore there is nothing really, at least for the average Arab, even educated Arab, there was nothing from Eastern Europe except this kind of goods. Arms, torture, secret police, spying. Of course, very few would know that this is a regime to regime. It has nothing to do with the people of Eastern Europe. But nevertheless, that is how the mental set formulated among many Arabs vis-à-vis Eastern Europe. That was not the case, of course, with Western Europe. And therefore, even when Eastern Europe managed to throw off the yoke of tyranny and communism and totalitarianism, the Arabs remain lukewarm toward Eastern Europe. It's only in the last 5 years that an Eastern European millionaire turned businessman here in the West by the name of George Soros thought that Arab democrats should have at least an opportunity to examine what happened in Eastern Europe. So through his another foundation called the Open Society Institute, OSI, began to organize a number of workshops, seminars, conferences, and even field visits to Arab democrats to Eastern Europe. I participated in some of these. I learned a lot. So did the tens of Arabs who participated in these activities. But that's still a small group. We learned not only that conditions immediately before the fall of communism are very similar to conditions in many of the Arab countries, but we also learned from Eastern Europeans who carried out the fight against communism, against tyranny in their countries. We learned from them how they made mistakes, how they managed to correct these mistakes. We learned from them how they used to elude the secret police, the tricks, and in their repertoire, how they used the media, how they used the outside world, and most importantly, how they managed fear. Fear is what intimidates a whole population. how the early activists in Eastern Europe were able to overcome this particular aspect that had enabled dictators with few thousand secret police to cow down a whole population. We learned quite, those who attended the seminars and the workshops. Well, we also learned that there is always a supply and demand on dictatorship. I said, what? Supply and demand. One of our Bulgarian comrades or activists said, yes. Having thrown off communism and authoritarianism doesn't mean that the battle was over. Because in many of these countries, there will always be some nostalgia for dictatorship. I said, nostalgia for dictatorship? They said yes, and start showing me the election results in one country after another. And in this one, that was last year, actually the old communists who changed their names to social democrats managed, in fact, to have a plurality. Why? He said, because their people look back at the days of communism and say, well, there was order, there was discipline, there were food supplies, they never went hungry, and there was not all of these huge class displays that now exist. So there was this nostalgia, especially among the older generation. And therefore, another lesson is never to take victory or triumph for granted, that there is a lot of educating to do at the grassroots, and there's a lot of things that early Democrats, especially when they manage to get to power, must really engage in. Another interesting lesson that we learned as Arab Democrats is how to deal with outside powers. In Eastern Europe, the West meant democracy, prosperity, and a good life. And they had no qualms in receiving Western messages. There was Radio Free Europe. There was Helsinki, which I talked already about. There was images of lifestyle in the West that appealed. Democracy was clear to Eastern Europe as it was played out in Western Europe. In the Arab world, the situation is different. We have three things going against the outside world. One of them is oil. Oil, which should have been a development blessing, has turned out to be a curse in disguise. A curse. Why? Because the West, George Bush, for example, who encouraged the drive for democracy, engaged since 9/11 in democracy promotion in our region. When it comes to really the last push for democracy, then somebody reminds him or remind the administration that there is oil and we need oil, and therefore we have to go easy. The other fear that has made the external actor play out differently in the case of the Arab world vis-a-vis or compared to Eastern Europe is Islamophobia, the fear of Islam. And when Hamas did well in Palestine, when the Muslim Brothers did well in the last election in Egypt, again, there was a chilling effect among the promoters of democracy in the West, including the United States. That also has reflected on the fear and suspicion of the external factors. Are they really sincere? That kind of question did not really exist in Eastern Europe, at least in the last 15 years before the fall of communism. It may have existed when some Eastern Europeans felt betrayed by the West, let's say after the crushing of the Hungarian uprisings in 1956, or the crushing of the Prague Spring Freedom in 68. But 10, 15 years had gone by, and the West became more committed. Reagan, Thatcher, and Helsinki, all of that made Eastern Europe look to the West and to the Western model without qualification. That kind of qualification, however, and reservation still exists in the Arab world because of the willingness of the West to always trade off oil for democracy and human rights and liberty, and that's why you hardly see criticism of Saudi Arabia. You hardly see criticism of the oil-producing rich Arab countries. That is a factor that we have not figured out how to deal with, how to neutralize oil in the equation in our drive for democracy. Another factor that we have not been able to factor in the equation is Israel. Again, we were reminded dramatically of the detrimental effect of this factor last summer when after Lebanese Cedar Revolution, which was very close to the Velvet Revolution, to the Origin Revolution, to the Rose Revolution, all of these revolutions in Eastern Europe, Lebanon had won in the spring of 2005. In fact, that was a close thing, and the Lebanese learned a lot from Eastern Europe. They were emulating what was happening in Czechoslovakia and Ukraine and Georgia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. And they managed to get rid of a 3-decade Syrian occupation. And they started restoring their own democracy and, in fact, creating a demonstration effect all over the Arab world. In 2005, let me remind you, there was 11 elections, unprecedented number of elections in the Arab world. In Palestine, in Iraq, in Egypt, in Kuwait, but even in Saudi Arabia, which is often considered by Arabs as the backwater of Arab politics. Even Saudi Arabia had municipal local election for the first time. So we had, in the year 2005, starting with the Lebanese Cedar Uprising, we had all of these openings in one Arab country after the other. Kuwait granted women the right of vote. Qatar ratified a new constitution to make their system a constitutional monarchy. Bahrain had already done that. Morocco had done that. So all of that was happening in the year 2005, thanks to that Cedar Revolution, which kind of, again, created these demonstration effects elsewhere. However, all of that came to an abrupt shock in the summer of 2006, 4 months ago, 5 months ago, with the border incident between Hezbollah and Israel and the unleashing of the Israeli war machine that destroyed much of Lebanon. Many Arabs began to, first of all, they felt solidarity with Lebanon, and regardless of who was at fault, Hezbollah or Israel, whatever. But the effect is, for the first time, Arabs were seeing a daily television display of that destruction. Even though the Arab-Israeli conflict has been in effect for 50 years, but that's the first time that the average Arab from Mauritania to Iraq, actually all over the world, We're seeing these scenes every day, the destruction. And of course, the average Arab does not have time to investigate exactly what happened, what triggered, who was at fault, and all of that. But that whole episode had a dampening effect on the democracy promotion in the Arab world. This is, again, another equation that we have not yet managed how to work out the inherent contradiction between security or national resistance to foreign hegemony and democracy. Do they have to be traded off one for the other? Well, luckily for Eastern Europe, they did not have to reconcile these two values, the value of national liberation or national dignity and the value of democracy and human rights. But again, there are lessons to learn from Eastern Europe. In the last 5 years, we have learned some lessons. There's still more to learn. And I'd like to take the opportunity here not only to thank and salute this Ratio Foundation, which brought us all together, but to call on them to step in and to sponsor a program of exchange between Arab Democrats and Romanians and other Eastern European, specifically because what George Soros did was commendable, but it involved probably 10, 15, 20, 30 activists who have gone back and forth. But there's more that we need to do. And I hope that the Ratio Foundation will take that challenge on. And that will be probably the greatest tribute to the great man on his name we came all here tonight. Thank you very much.
Could I ask you to remain seated for a few more minutes? Saad, I think you may want to sit. You have been standing. We have time for literally 2 very short questions because I'm told by the organizers I should stop at 6. So please, no comments, just very brief questions. And I think Saad will, if he still has any voice left, will answer. And if Ahmed would like to comment something on it, you can join. But I really, if your question is long, I'm going to interrupt you. Yes, please identify yourself and wait for the mic, please. Just 1 second. Yes, please.
I'm from Colorado, and I wanted to ask that as a Muslim, I'm being led to understand that Muslims should not question their leaders, that they should assume that if somebody has reached a leadership position, they were assigned it by God, and therefore Muslims are reluctant to do revolutions. So that's
Okay.
my question.
Saad, you want to go first?
Very quickly, that is a myth that dictators have managed to spread and internalize. And that myth is based on a saying by the Umayyads when they took over and turned governance from Shura to royal dynasty, the Umayyads. And the saying was, would rather put up was a tyrant than have division and sedition in our community. And the saying in Arabic, حكم غشوم وفتنة لا تدوم, would rather have a dictatorship than sedition and division. That's nonsense, and I think enough Muslim and Arab countries have discovered it is nonsense. It is a dictator's proposition, and we ought not even repeat it or help them to propagate it.
You're right. In most parts of the Muslim world, particularly at the village level, in rural areas, this is exactly what many leaders do say. And therefore they deprive women of their rights, they deprive the less privileged of their rights. The time for change has come. Leaders like you have to speak up and have as much legitimacy to speak for Islam as other people. It all depends on the amount of scholarship and wisdom you bring, and I think people do respond to that.
Yes, please. Yes. Speak up. It doesn't matter if it doesn't work. Just speak up. Yeah, please.
I'm TJ from Congressman Todd Hagen's office. My question is, I've read a lot of your articles on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and you said that you think they are committed to democracy and they should be engaged in the political system. And I've heard a lot about how their internal system is not democratic. They're still hierarchical. They haven't really made any major ideological changes. So why do you argue that they are committed to democracy? What is your evidence?
The question, very brief, was that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt that you promote discussing to them necessarily are not a democratic institution or group, so why do you argue about talking to them?
All right, very good question, and I'm glad you asked it. When I compare the Muslim Brotherhood and the National Democratic Party, which is the ruling party headed by Mubarak, I found that the Muslim Brotherhood are far more democratic. They have changed their leader 6 times. Whereas with the NDP, we still have the same leader for the last 25 years. And there may not be the best democracy there is, but at least they have enough in the way of electing leaders than the ruling party, NDP. Not to mention other examples like Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad and so on.
Okay. Yes, the lady here, please. I think this mic works if you wait, and I'll take one more question, and that's it. Yeah.
My name is Christine Tennant. I'm a UN consultant, and I focus on human rights and humanitarian issues. I've worked out of the Middle East and lived in both the Middle East for 10 years, in Egypt, which I love.
Question, please.
I lived in Eastern Europe, preceding and following the fall collapse of communism. I wrote a book on the subject about plus and minus aspects of the collapse. My problem here was a wonderful presentation that you gave, really excellent. But the problem, I think, is the fundamental concept of democracy, East versus West. Now you have the question of secularism versus a religious society. This, you can't define democracy in terms of the separation of church and state. We do here. It's all right. This is how we define America. We have many different religious groups and subcultures. The Middle East, the emphasis is not on secularism, it's not on consumerism. It's still on another aspect of society, and that's basic human welfare and religious values.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you because we just have Saad. You want to take it?
Well,
okay.
right. I mean, you are raising a very legitimate question. Do Muslim societies accept the separation between religion and state? Very legitimate. And I think for the time being, it is some do and some don't. And therefore, our job as Democrats is to promote that orderly separation. It may not come in one blow,
No
because it never did in the West either. It took the West several centuries to complete that separation between state and church. We are saying that in our text, in the Quran, there is no Islamic state. However, those who want to promote that say they read it differently. So it is our job, just like it happened in the West, is to keep promoting that separation or at least regulation. People will cite Western examples that the Queen of England is the head of the state or the head of the church, and that even in American democracy there's a good deal of religious discourse and vocabulary, especially nowadays with all the Christian right and so on. But that is really part of a discourse, part of the dynamics, political dynamics. So long as we have freedom to promote ideas and to compete, I think ultimately we will be able to do that kind of separation.
And I'm sorry, I won't let you follow up because we have one.
Yes, we need to be careful, Christian, about stereotypes. When you talk about we being secular and they being Islamic, I don't know what you mean. Because when I talk about a president who says my favorite book is the Holy Book, when you have In God We Trust on a dollar bill, when you have a president and an administration talking about a vision of the end of time hurtling towards us, are we talking about Muslim presidents, Muslim dollar bills, Muslim visions of the world? So let us be careful about jumping into stereotypes, because if you have them, so do other people. We need to step back and try to really work out what's happening in our world today.
Okay. Last question, please. There. Yeah. This way.
My name is Stephen Shore. Dr. Ibrahim, how central is a permanent settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians to the triumph of democracy in the Arab world?
Very relevant question and very relevant issue. I believe that so long as the Arab-Israeli conflict remains unresolved, there will always be a big question mark about how people will sign on for democracy. And my belief is that Israel is a democracy in its own right, despite all of our qualification, but it is democracy for its own citizens, but not democracy for people that it controls. And if Mr. Olmert last initiative to recognize the Palestinian rights and the Palestinian entitlement to a state of their own, if that, in fact, is carried to its natural course, I think it will help our cause a lot. Because we as Democrats had a setback every time there is a problem between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Because again, it is national security versus liberty. And even in your country, after 9/11, when national security was threatened, you had the Patriot Act, you have a lot of draconian measures that undermine a democratic society. So it is not just the Arabs in this case, it is all the people in the world. When security is at question, then democracy takes a back seat. So let's hope that this will not continue.
On such a hopeful note or gloomy note, I'm not sure which one it is, I would like to thank the Ratio family and the foundation for having chosen the Wilson Center as a venue for this evening and the democracy lecture. I would also like to thank my two very good friends, Dr. Saad Ibrahim and Ambassador Akbar Ahmed, to have been with us tonight. Could I ask you please to remain seated until our speakers leave the room and then leave the room? So that's what I have been told. And my apologies for not letting follow-up questions, but I was told we are running out of time. So thank you for coming and thank you to our speakers. Thanks for coming, really.